Marcus Veltri left that charity gala in handcuffs, his empire dissolved overnight, his name erased from every board and every deed he had spent 30 years building, and the woman who did it was standing in the corner of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching him go with the same quiet expression she had worn the night he called her the ugliest thing he'd ever seen walk through a door. That was 18 months ago, and nobody in that room tonight understood yet what they had just witnessed. Her name was Nadia Corso. She was 31 years old, with dark hair she kept pinned back during working hours, and let fall loose on the rare evenings she allowed herself to stop working. She was full-figured in the way of someone who had never treated her body as a problem to be solved. Broad shoulders, rounded hips, the kind of presence that occupied a room without announcing itself. She had a master's degree in forensic accounting from Columbia and the kind of mind that could read a balance sheet the way other people read faces. She had grown up in Queens, daughter of a woman who cleaned offices on Fifth Avenue and a father who had disappeared before Nadia learned to read. She had built everything herself, with compound interest and 12-hour days, until she was good enough that people in the right rooms started to notice. Nadia Corso noticed. He was 43, ran the most disciplined financial network east of Chicago under the cover of a legitimate investment holding company, and had exactly two things he refused to tolerate: disloyalty and incompetence. His money was clean on paper because someone very skilled made it clean. When that someone retired, Dante spent 4 months interviewing replacements before a name kept surfacing from sources he trusted: Nadia Corso. She said yes, for one reason. She needed the firm's infrastructure to finish tracing a wire transfer series that had gone cold 2 years ago, when her mother's savings had been emptied by a shell company she couldn't crack without access to the kind of private banking records only someone like Dante could reach. She told him she was interested in the challenge. That was partly true, the whole truth she kept for herself. She started in September. She learned the architecture of his operation in 3 weeks, which was 2.5 weeks faster than anyone before her. She kept her findings organized in formats so clean that Dante's senior advisors quietly started using her terminology in their own reports. She said little in meetings. She dressed in dark, unremarkable clothes. She asked no favors, drew no attention, and attended every event she was required to attend with the same composed expression that some people mistook for shyness. She was not shy. She was building something, and she needed everyone in that world to underestimate her until she was finished. Dante watched her more than she knew. He told himself it was due diligence. Marcus Veltri had been in Dante's orbit for 11 years, not under him, but adjacent, the kind of man who existed in the margins of power by attaching himself to whoever held it. He ran 3 mid-size real estate firms, skimmed from partnerships in ways he believed were too subtle to trace, and had grown wealthy enough to believe his own reputation. He was the kind of man who had been attractive at 25 and spent the next 2 decades expecting the world to remember that. He had gone to the same Queens high school as Nadia Corso. She had known exactly who he was when she saw his name on Dante's guest list for the October gala. She had said nothing about it to anyone. Marcus recognized her at the gala. That was obvious from the way he stopped when he saw her across the room. Not with recognition, but with the particular calculation of a man deciding what to do with something that doesn't fit the picture he's arranged around himself. He crossed the room. Dante was 20 feet away, talking to 2 people from a private equity firm, his back partly turned. Marcus stopped in front of Nadia and looked at her the way someone looks at a piece of furniture that's been placed in the wrong room. "Nadia Corso," he said. "God, you look exactly the same." She said, "Hello, Marcus. I didn't know Dante was hiring from, well," he gestured vaguely at her. "You know, they must have lowered the standards for the gala list." Someone nearby laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound. A woman to Nadia's left stepped back slightly, distancing herself from whatever was about to happen. "Still carrying all that weight around," Marcus said, his voice the kind of quiet that's engineered to carry. "I thought by now, 30 is when most women decide to do something about themselves, but I guess some people just give up." The room didn't go silent because Marcus was too careful for that. He kept his voice social, friendly almost, the tone of someone catching up with an old acquaintance. That was the sophistication of the cruelty. It could always be denied later. Nadia looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. "You always did talk the most when you had the least to say," she said, and turned back to the person she'd been speaking with before he arrived. Marcus stood there for a moment with the expression of someone who'd expected a different reaction. Then he laughed, a short social laugh, and moved on. Across the room, Nadia Corso had turned slightly. He had heard everything. His expression did not change, but he remembered. Psychologists who study public humiliation, particularly Dr. Keltner at UC Berkeley, whose research on power and social hierarchies spans 3 decades, distinguish between shame that collapses a person and shame that clarifies them. The difference lies not in the wound itself, but in what the person does with the information. For some, a moment like what Marcus just delivered becomes proof of their own inadequacy. For others, it becomes data. Nadia Corso had always been the second kind. She had been the second kind since she was 14 years old, and Marcus Veltri had said almost the same thing to her in a hallway full of people who laughed. She had been planning for moments like this her entire adult life. She just hadn't planned on using Marcus as the final piece of something much larger than a personal score. What she found in Dante's records the following week changed the shape of everything she thought she was building. The wire transfer series she'd been chasing for 2 years, the one that had gutted her mother's savings account through a chain of shell entities, ended at a holding company registered in Delaware. She'd always known that. What she hadn't had access to before was the layer beneath. The beneficial ownership records that Dante's network reached through a private banking relationship in Zurich. The Delaware company was owned by a trust. The trust was administered by a name she knew, Marcus Veltri. He hadn't just humiliated her in a high school hallway 17 years ago. He had been running a financial predation scheme for a decade, targeting working-class account holders through a network of fraudulent investment products sold under names that sounded legitimate. Her mother had been one of several thousand victims. The total exposure was somewhere above $80 million. Marcus had been moving this money through structures that overlapped, almost but not quite, with entities connected to Dante's legitimate holdings, not Dante's scheme. Marcus using the proximity of Dante's name as cover, because nobody would look too hard at a financial vehicle that smelled like it might be protected. Nadia sat with that information for 48 hours. She built the documentation carefully, sourcing every connection through records she could access without triggering any flags. She was meticulous. She was quiet. She said nothing to Dante. She had one more thing to do before this became a conversation. Marcus hosted a quarterly investor dinner at a private club on the Upper East Side. The guests were the kind of people who had enough money to have lawyers who had lawyers. Nadia was not on the guest list. She was there because the events coordinator was a woman she'd helped refinance her apartment 3 years ago, and Nadia had made one phone call. She arrived as the dinner was already seated. She moved to the back of the room with the ease of someone who belongs anywhere she decides to be. Marcus was at the head of the table, mid-story, visibly at the height of his social performance. She set a folder on the table in front of the man seated to Marcus's left, a federal compliance officer she recognized from his LinkedIn profile, who Marcus apparently did not know she knew attended these dinners. "I think you've been looking for the beneficial ownership chain on the Silverline Family Trust," she said quietly, directly to the compliance officer. "It's documented from the Delaware registration through the Zurich administration layer. The routing instructions are on page 4. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Marcus while she said it. The compliance officer opened the folder. His expression shifted in the way of someone who has just found something he didn't expect to find in a place he didn't expect to find it. Marcus went very still. "Nadia," he started. "I know," she said, and looked at him for the first time. "You thought I was just carrying weight around." She left the folder on the table and walked toward the exit. She had sent the full documentation package to 3 separate regulatory bodies 4 hours earlier. The dinner was theater. The theater was for her. She allowed herself that. She was halfway through the lobby when Dante fell into step beside her. She had not heard him enter. She had not known he was there. "How long?" he said, not a question. "The documentation? 4 months. You knew about Marcus. Since week 3. He was quiet for a moment. They walked through the lobby and out into the November air. You didn't tell me, he said. I needed access to the Zurich records through your infrastructure to complete the chain. I needed it to be airtight before it became your problem too. If I'd told you early, you would have moved on him before I had everything, and he would have walked. Dante stopped walking. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the careful assessment he'd worn for 4 months, but something less managed. He used proximity to my name as cover for a decade, she said. That makes this your problem whether you wanted it or not. I gave you clean hands by doing this the way I did it. You're welcome. The silence lasted long enough to be significant. He's been skimming from a partnership we share, Dante said finally. I knew there were irregularities. I didn't have the chain. Page 7, she said. It's documented. He looked at her for a long moment. There was a man standing 20 feet behind them. She'd clocked him the moment they stepped outside, one of Dante's security, which meant Dante had been in that club longer than the last 3 minutes. He had watched. She had known he might. She had not adjusted anything she did because of it. He had made exactly one mistake that night, and it was underestimating how long she'd already been playing this game. Marcus Veltri is going to lose everything by morning, Dante said. He already has, she said. I filed 6 hours ago. Something shifted in Dante Caruso's face. Not softness. He wasn't a soft man, and she didn't want him to be. But recognition. The look of a man who has been watching a chess game and has just understood that the player he thought was a pawn has been moving pieces from the beginning. John Gottman, after 4 decades studying how power dynamics operate between people, identified the precise opposite of contempt as what he called admiration. Not affection, not desire, but the specific experience of watching someone be fully, completely themselves and finding it impossible to look away. It does not arrive gradually. It arrives the way Marcus Veltri's world arrived at its end, all at once, and without warning. I want you in a different seat, Dante said, not accounting. I know, she said again. I've been drafting the restructure proposal for 6 weeks. He laughed. A short, real sound, not the social kind. Of course you have. They stood on the sidewalk in the cold, and for the first time in 4 months, neither of them was performing anything. Marcus Veltri was arrested at 7 a.m. the following morning, at his apartment on the 42nd floor of a building he would not own by the following week. He spent the car ride to the federal building explaining to anyone who would listen that there had been a mistake, that he knew people, that this was not how things ended for men like him. He was wrong about that. Nadia watched the news alert come through on her phone from the small office she had used for 4 months, the one she was about to vacate for something considerably larger. She noted the time, finished her coffee, and closed her laptop. 3 floors up, Dante Caruso was waiting with a chair at a table she had already earned. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for someone else to correct what was done to them. Nadia Corso spent hers making sure that when the correction came, it would be in her own handwriting. If that's the kind of story you want more of, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm someone here is paying attention. Subscribe if you want the next one, because the woman in that story is only getting started.